I remember in high school as well, I was just not fitting in, having such a difficult time to like even pass classes when I knew I could do well in academics. And I would get kicked out of classes. And if you have any interest in tech, just go to Silicon Valley. I honestly think part of that is just not being afraid and having the mindset that you can learn anything.
How did you find your co-founder?
I've been actually working on a lot of different ideas. The first version we built was like all in simulation, a Gazebo Simulation. And then we used that to raise a few small angel checks from a few angel investors. And then even initially to get the initial checks from the Gazebo Simulation, it was like, okay, reach out to, hundreds of people. And then to raise our pre-seed, probably like reaching out to thousands of people. We are Cavalla, and we can make any forklifts autonomous by installing an add-on to it.
I found your journey really interesting. Like you came into the US in a very young age and alone, and then you started your journey there. I found that really interesting and maybe inspiring to many of the audience who will hopefully listen or watch this video. How about you to talk about your personal journey coming to the US and going to high school here, graduate, going to college, all of that. Tell us more about it.
Absolutely, thank you. I think, in life, a lot of times, as Steve Jobs says, it's really hard to connect the dots moving forwards, but looking back, they somehow just connect. And I think for me, the biggest theme of life so far has just been trying to discover new things, trying to find new ways of achieving things. And I remember in high school as well, I was just not fitting in, having such a difficult time to like even pass classes when I knew I could do well in academics. And I would get kicked out of classes. And I was like, okay, like, have to find a way to graduate high school. I don't think I can do it by myself. So I went online and found out about boarding schools in the US and just got into one after working on it for about a year and a half of like applying different places. And you might be asking, okay, like, was there like any more planning to it? But no, it was literally it. And I usually tell people I like hit the jackpot because, you get one letter that changes your life. And like, I remember my dad coming in and be like, hey, like, I think you have a letter, but like it's in English, and opening it up and be like, what? Um, and yeah, I think since then, just been through a tumultuous journey of being an international student in the US, wanting to go into academia, and was really into math. Um, but then ultimately, I'm really thankful to end up in Silicon Valley because I find the types of problems I can work on to be um, way more interesting.
Yeah, that was my next question. I saw in a previous podcast you did that you had two other options. You had Austin and Boston, and you just decided to come to San Francisco. Why San Francisco?
Yeah, great question. And like I think back then, if you had asked me, I would have definitely like chosen Austin and Boston. But that's another one of those events where I'm like, I got so lucky because at that time in 2020, Clubhouse was becoming really popular. And I happened to be on a Clubhouse talking with people. And somebody from Silicon Valley was like, no, if you have any interest in tech, just go to Silicon Valley. Do not go to Austin just because it's like a slightly cheaper rent or anything else.
And this is when you were in Iran, right? Not in the US.
I was in Wisconsin.
Oh,
I was
okay.
yeah. I was a sophomore in college, trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, and the pandemic had hit, so you have extra time on your hand, a lot of time for reflection.
Oh, interesting. So you were a sophomore in Wisconsin, and then did you graduate there and then move to San Francisco, or can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I somewhat graduated. I would say I was basically working for a startup throughout my junior year, and then I did one semester of senior year and basically like early graduated. But that one semester was online too, so kind of like checked out halfway through college, and basically was really working hard on
You
startup
were
ideas.
working on an idea during your senior years, right?
So yeah, like after the sophomore year, I basically found out a way to work for a startup throughout my junior year. And I was still in Wisconsin. It was a startup in the Midwest as well, but it just gave me a taste of like how exciting it can be to be on the frontiers, to basically decide your destiny by working with customers, by building new products. And as soon as I had that taste, I was like, I want to keep going. It was addicting. So at the end of my junior year, I moved to the Valley, and senior year was basically working on my own thing.
Very interesting and impressive, actually. Like you were already working on an idea and then you moved to San Francisco. And I know San Francisco is very expensive. How did you manage to survive and build a startup in San Francisco?
No, yeah, great question. Great question. And like I think it's really hard to like do the math in your head and be like, $2,000 of extra living expenses is going to be worth it. But I think just the energy and the willingness of everyone to be at the top of their game is something that it's hard to put a price for. For me, honestly, it was like live as cheaply as possible. The first 4 or 5 months, I also had another job that I was working. Actually, that was like the first robotics company I was working at, called Novark Technologies. And that was my introduction to robotics as well. And so it's always been like either take consulting gigs here and there and then save up and also like live very cheaply, just trim life into its bare necessities.
I see. So after you graduated, you did an internship with a company, right? Did you do only one or two internships and then you worked full time for a while and then like more seriously working on your idea? Or what was it like? Like was it immediately after you graduated, or can you dive deeper into like graduation until you started your own startup?
Absolutely. So I've only done one internship, which was on Novark, and that was the summer before graduation. And then after graduation, um, I've been working on my own startups and then doing consulting gigs on the side. And I also had like one other job for 4 months just to prove to my parents that I can get a big company job. But it was mostly a way to just have a big company job and say I can get it. And
I
that
see.
was with BHP, which is a giant mining company.
Okay. And did any of these experiences, the startup, the internship, the 4 months of full-time job, help you with your own startup as well? Or was it mostly like, as you mentioned, maybe a bridge between graduation and founding your company? What was the experience? Because that's something that I've been asked by a lot of people. Is it like, should they start working for a startup and company to just gain the experience, better understand the domain, and then start their own thing? Or what are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. I mean, the way I think about it is that, when you're building a startup, you're basically competing on learning about the world and executing on that knowledge. And I think working elsewhere really helps on like understanding the world part, especially in like some startup ideas. You definitely really need to have that baseline knowledge. But on the execution side, I've heard even from like early engineers at companies that have been very successful that like the experience of being an early, like even the first engineer is not comparable to being a founder. Because on the founder, you're just like absolutely on the front line. Every problem is your problem. And so I would say like for gaining the knowledge about a certain industry, certain domain, it's definitely very helpful. But I wouldn't like rely on it as the only um, set of skill sets you need to start a company. Obviously, like the execution part is also very important, and nothing prepares you better than just doing it.
I see. And then at such a young age, how did you learn some of these skills that are needed to build a product, especially like a robotics product? As we all know, robotics is very complex, difficult. It needs, several skill set from several different disciplines. How did you learn all of these? And for the very first time when you started your own company, how difficult was it to build your own product?
I honestly think part of that is just not being afraid and having the mindset that you can learn anything. Um, because I think we live in a world where like it's very compartmentalized. And if you're a professional, like trying to do well at a job at a big company, it's very beneficial for you to specialize. But when you're a founder trying to find ideas, obviously every idea you choose, like you have to learn a lot of new things about it. So I think the skill of like being able to learn new things and being a absolute amateur at something is very important, and not feeling bad about that. And I think the other part of it is just being around very talented people, grabbing coffee with like the right people so that you can accelerate your learning. I think I've been very lucky with my co-founder as well. Um, and just having that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, get your hands dirty, start something. Even I work for a corporation, right? I work for a big company. Even the projects I'm working on is mostly I learned through, on the job training. Like, get the project going, get it started, and just learn on the way. It's even for like big companies and big projects. That's how mostly for me it works. And so you mentioned your co-founder. How did you find your co-founder, and what qualities stood out?
I think like the process of finding a co-founder for me took about a good 8 months too, after like working with a lot of potential candidates. I mainly went on YC co-founder match, and I also met other people through my own network. Ultimately, the co-founder I landed with, Victor, came from YC co-founder match. But I think the biggest change in the way I was able to find them was just focusing on the right traits. And I sat down and I was like, what are the traits in a co-founder that like I think I can't have enough of, right? Like what are the traits that I can't compromise on anybody even being very good at? I want them to be exceptionally really good at those. And as soon as I did that, I was like, okay, now I'm not looking for like 9 different traits. I'm looking for like 2 different traits and trying to really filter for those two. And for me, those two were just having really, really high ambition and being willing to work on something for years after years. And also being willing to learn anything and being a very fast learner. Bet on someone's slope instead of the place they are in life.
Right. Yeah. And how difficult was it? Like a team of two people, understand how difficult it might be. Like, again, robotics is very complex, and with a very small team, like mainly you and your co-founder, you were able to hit the ground running, develop the product. I know you're still working on it. What are your thoughts there? How difficult was it, and everything about it?
Great question. I think there are 2 parts to that question. One, to me, the hardest part is like scoping things at the right level and trying to focus on what matters on a day-to-day basis. And for us, it was like, so initially we don't have the money to like build a fully functional product. So how can we show um, and basically de-risk the biggest questions around our product?
I guess now is the right time to talk about your product, your startup. What is the name of their startup? What's the product? So just tell us more about the company, the startup, the product, and why this product, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. So we're Cavalla, and we can make any forklifts autonomous by installing an add-on to it. And for us, we envision a world where warehouses of all sizes have the capabilities that have been exclusive to multi-billion-dollar warehouses and allow them to adopt autonomy very easily and with ROI positive from day one.
Wow. Wow. W- What does Cavalla mean? Educate me. English is my second language, so
It's actually a horse in Italian. I been obsessed with horses as animals, and I honestly think they are one of the most overlooked pieces of history because domesticating animals and taming animals was what allowed us as humans to get to industrial revolution and be so much more productive than before. It allowed for commerce, and we think that the next level of civilizational progress would be to tame machines. And so,
very interesting idea for sure. Yes. So how did you come across this idea? Like, what was it like? Like, was it the first idea that you came across, or you tried maybe two or three different ideas and then you came across this idea?
I've been actually working on a lot of different ideas, and a lot of them were actually like B2B SaaS ideas in the beginning when I came to Silicon Valley. But I ultimately realized that like I just wasn't able to get myself really, really excited to my core for software. And so after a while, just switched into looking into industrials and ultimately robotics. And I think the premise behind Cavalla started when, after working for a robotics company, Novark, and also working for BHP, the giant mining company, realizing that robotics is not like a problem of capability anymore. Meaning that we do have all the pieces of tech, at least like a lot of amazing pieces of tech. It's just like the gap from capability to adoption is still very, very wide. We basically wanted to design a product that's able to be adopted very easily, be able to distribute it very easily.
Right. But how did you learn about, like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And then how did you learn about that problem that later became like an idea?
So for us, the vast majority of warehouses out there have no automation. And even when you walk in today at a 1 million square foot facility, and these businesses are making, something around like $5 to $10 million of revenue every year, they're still moving every piece of pallet good they have manually with forklifts. And there's a lot of movement that happens within a warehouse on a day-to-day basis. And one way to automate everything is like be an Amazon, just start a facility around the automation equipment you have, or put in millions of dollars up front to be able to adopt autonomy. But what we realized is that will never be feasible for the vast majority of the warehouses out there. And so we wanted to find a way where adopting autonomy just becomes a no-brainer for them. When we talked with multiple warehouses, realized that over time they were competitive against like bigger companies just because their service offerings were different. But every time that labor shortages hit US, and they've been way more severe recently, their business starts becoming infeasible at some point. And we think we are close to a point where a lot of these businesses are becoming infeasible.
But the very first time, when was it that you came across that problem? And then you said, I can solve this.
The first time was talking with a 3PL, and 3PL being third-party logistics company down in Southern California. And these warehouses are warehouses that if you had an e-commerce company, you wouldn't like put all of your t-shirts or goods in your basement to ship them out. You usually ship it to a third-party warehouse and they will handle it for you. And as we were talking to them, we were kind of like pitching ourselves as like robotics consultants and just trying to learn more about like their day to day, what do they spend most of their time on. And I think there we just realized how hard it was and how much of like 3PL owners' time is just spent on hiring, trying to retain people, especially when amount of demand for their services is very spiky. So around Christmas, around the holidays, they get so many different orders. And so you have to like double the capacity of your uh, facility within a few months.
I see. Yeah, it's mostly seasonal for some of the businesses, right? Christmas, Thanksgiving, Black Friday. Right, right.
Prime
And
days.
yeah, right, Prime Days, right. So how did you validate the market need? Was it mostly through customer feedback or market research, or what was it?
Absolutely. So we're a big fan of just like going in person and talking with people on the ground, and especially for, warehousing, that's been really amazing because some of these companies don't even have a website. They just get their order through another company that markets their 3PL services. And so there's really not a good like online way to get a good understanding of the market. So for us, that's been really amazing. And we basically got a lot of conviction over it as soon as we were able to sign a few letters of intent and realize that those people are giving us also feedback aside from signing a letter of intent.
Gotcha. And what was your proof of concept development process like? And then how many iterations did you go through? Did it take?
Absolutely. So initially, we just thought, maybe we can just get a forklift and try to make it autonomous one way or another. But over time, realized that there are other like autonomous forklift companies. Why is it that a lot of warehouses don't adopt those solutions? And after going through the process of how much time and resources does it get to like get one of those services deployed, came up with our current idea. And I think throughout our prototype development, we've gone through the exact um, I don't know if you've seen the picture of how it says if you're trying to build a car, don't start from the wheels. Start from building a scooter and then build a motorcycle and then build a car. For us too, it was very similar. Like the first version we built was like all in simulation, a gazebo simulation, just to show that we can do the path planning very easily and have some sort of like safety system that's able to recognize its surrounding. And then we use that to raise a few small angel checks from a few angel investors. And
Oh,
then we bought a very small forklift.
oh, very interesting. So you were able to raise funding without even having a physical product, right? It's just
Yes.
simulation.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Which is actually, yeah, like we feel, super grateful because if it wasn't for those early believers, like everything was just, on a napkin and like a few gazebo simulations. And we had one letter of intent. But
Yeah, I might have seen one of your investors in the My First Million Dollar podcast. I think someone was there and talking about your work and your startup there.
absolutely, Forcon.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, actually, the warehouse facility we're in is owned by them. It's Founders Inc.'s warehouse facility. So yeah, we're very grateful to have them.
Oh,
And
nice. And then I know you're very young, right? And how difficult was it to to raise your initial funding, and considering how young you are and you did not have many years of experience, you mostly just an internship and a few months of full time job. How difficult was it?
I wish I could come in here and like have like a few tips about how to like run a perfect fundraise process and um, go into meetings flawlessly. But the truth is, like, I honestly made a lot of mistakes throughout the process. It took way longer than we were expecting it to take, and it almost killed our company at some point. So I think for me, it was just doing the reps that did the job done. So even initially to get the initial checks from the Gazebo simulation, it was like, okay, reach out to, hundreds of people. And then to raise our pre-seed, probably like reaching out to thousands of people.
Wow.
And
Thousands of people.
yes, totally, totally. And it was like anything from like our networks, my co-founder and my network, going in person and events, meeting people, reaching cold emails to LinkedIn messages. And I think from there, we had probably around like 80 meetings. And out of those 80 meetings, we had probably two or three big investors that ended up committing most of the round.
Nice. And this is when you only had the gazebo simulation, right?
So the Gazebo simulation, it was like a few hundred reach outs to get to like a very small, like friends and family type of round. And then the rest was with a physical forklift. Um, it was our last generation forklift that was able to do like basic path planning by itself.
I see it. I see it. And then can you talk about how expensive was it to develop this add-on to the forklift? And then what goes, if you can share, what goes into that kit?
Absolutely. So for us, initially, we only had a $10,000 budget. So we had to really work hard to um, make it go far. So we were able to like find a $4,500 forklift somewhere around San Francisco, and it was an electric forklift that like just worked on extremely flat surfaces, and that was it. Like any sort of slight um, steepness would like make it stop. Some days it would just like smell super bad. It seemed like some sort of oil internal uh, thing was going wrong with it. And yeah, like I think for us the promising thing was as soon as we got our hands on that forklift in our space, we were able to get it moving within 3 or 4 days. And that was basically like trying to reverse engineer the controller system on the forklift. And the basic idea around our kit is, we have cameras and LiDAR system around the forklift. We gather a lot of data, and that data gets processed on the edge. And based off of that, as you make a decision, that decision is sent to the um, software control system that we have. And that control system basically translates that into the signals that the forklift control system gets.
I see. I see. And now is your kit ready now? Like, do you have the first generation or do you have a deadline or you have like a date in mind that you're gonna, finish the first generation?
We've been able to have the proof of concept on the first forklift that we worked with. And now this is the second forklift we've had that will go into production within the next month. So I think right now there are a few challenges that we're working on. One is making the kit adaptable to new models of forklifts and new controller systems, because we've only been able to work with two for controller systems so far. And the other one is making the installation process very easy. And our goal is the customers themselves can install it within a few hours.
Nice, nice. And then how expensive would it be for the customers to buy and then install it on their own forklift?
Our goal is to have a RAS model. With that, you only pay 35,000 per year per unit. And with that, we expect like our customers to get 3 or 4x ROI. The nice part about doing it that way is that as a customer, you don't have to think about like any sort of complicated robotics math. It's kind of like, okay, instead of hiring somebody to run a forklift, I basically have a very reliable forklift driver for this price.
Yeah, okay. So again, I know like robotics is a combination of hardware and software and it's complex, and because you have hardware in the equation, then overall it's much more difficult to develop, especially for startups. It's much more difficult to develop a robotics product compared to like a pure software product like SaaS or any software product. And you briefly touched on it, but what was the reason you basically moved out of those SaaS or software, like pure software, to something that has a combination of software and hardware, such as the product that you're working on right now?
Great question. Um, I think for me, you know, when I came to Silicon Valley, obviously, like software was really hot. It seemed like, we were at the peak of the biggest bull market in history. And at that point, it just seemed like it was so easy to make money. And for a lot of people, that was um, the lure, and it was cool to just do startups. But going through the history of Silicon Valley, what I've realized is that like the original Silicon Valley um, creation was from very niche ideas and very actually what we would call deep tech ideas. It just happened that at that time, deep tech was software. I realized that deep tech is just so much more interesting in terms of working with new type of technology that's not figured out. There's not a specific playbooks for it. And those sort of problems were so much more attractive for me. And it was basically like a rule I set for myself where it's like if there's like a very agreed upon playbook for something, if there are very um, by the book way of doing things, I just wouldn't be that excited about.
I see. And I heard in other podcasts that you mentioned that traditional startup guidebook is outdated. Why is that?
I think as soon as I started working in robotics, what I realized that there was two camps of people like giving advice out there. One camp was from like the traditional robotics companies, and the other camp was like software people that were trying to get into robotics. And I mean, I don't think I have like anything specific against them, but my intuition is that the innovation would actually come from different areas than what I'm seeing. So I would say the traditional robotics playbook is find, a narrow problem, try to build a robot that solves that narrow problem. And that narrow problem is usually like a dangerous task. I would say the software people getting into robotics playbook, it's kind of like try to find a horizontal problem, build a very generalizable solution, like a humanoid, and um, that would basically have the chance to be very, very successful. And I think it's like very product heavy. But what I've realized is that the hardest thing about robotics is just same thing, like adoption and the distribution of a product and a lot of other areas that you need to innovate on. For example, financing for a lot of customers is really hard, and it's not trivial to know like how are you able to find the right financing partners or finance something even internally. The other one, I would say business model matters a lot. And I've seen like a lot of companies go from building a product to sell to companies that do something to like they do that work themselves and become a competitor to their previous customers. It's kind of like I think these both groups and ideologies have some truth in them, but I, I would advise anybody coming into robotics to understand where they actually need to innovate. And sometimes it could just be like, hey, like we need to find better financing options for these customers. Otherwise, like the product is basically being solved.
I see. So you're saying it's not always only about the product. It's the entire journey, right? It's from maybe the idea to the product to the customer to the finance to everything, like the entire journey of the product.
I think, like how you're able to finance your product should be even considered part of the product to me, just because it could make like life an order of magnitude easier for your customers.
I see. And again, I remember from the previous podcast that you mentioned you read a book that had a profound impact on your entrepreneurial journey. Can you talk about that book and why it had an impact on you?
Absolutely. So I think there's been actually few books in my life that have had such profound impact. One was Sophie's World, growing up, and I remember reading it in actually Persian. And um, the biggest thing about that book was just like allowed me to be infinitely curious about things and not feel like that was like a weird thing that I had to suppress. And I remember as soon as like I read that book, I like stopped trying to like always be cool socially and sort of like ended up hanging out with like the same 3 or 4 people in my school that ultimately helped me um, be way more confident and come to the US.
I see. And then I remember you mentioned another book was called, if I'm not mistaken, Super Founder.
Yes, yes. And I initially when I came to Silicon Valley, Super Founders was really impactful book, and it basically goes quantitatively through the um, I think 2008 to 2018, the data from all entrepreneurs that raised any type of VC funding, and it looks at what are the patterns the unicorn founders had.
I see. And then what lessons did that book teach you?
Great question. It's basically like there's not that many patterns. Like there are some, ones where it's like, okay, if you're a second time founder, you have better odds. If you've already had a success as an entrepreneur, you have better odds. But besides that, there's really not like a significant pattern in terms of like founders who are technical, non-technical, or like founders who went to these types of schools or those types of schools. And to me, the takeaway for that, it's kind of like every company is unique. Um, you shouldn't like disqualify yourself just because you don't fit the mold. Um, and I would say at each time in Silicon Valley, it seems like some sort of idea, some sort of archetype becomes cool, but historically like that doesn't correlate with success at all. So I just hope that people don't disqualify themselves if they see the drive to do something.
I see. Yeah. And I was just wondering where this entrepreneurial mindset that you have at such a young age come from. Is it your early experience in the US has anything to do with it? Is it even like before you came to the US? Why do you think you're very entrepreneurial at this young age?
Thank you. I honestly like I still wonder about it, and you can go back to your childhood and think about like specific events that led you to think about the world differently, and whether it's like okay those events or something like more internal about you that has always been there. But I think for me, the biggest thing is just going after the hardest problems I could work on. And that's just so exciting. And at this time, entrepreneurship is like the best expression of that feeling, the best expression of adventure and wandering through infinite possibilities and opportunities and trying to pick the best path.
Cool. Just was wondering what's next for Cavalla in terms of product development and scaling.
Absolutely. So for us, it's basically integrating with new systems and also making the installation process very easy for our customers. And afterwards, I think the biggest problem would be building the best fleet management systems for our customers. And I think ultimately, I sometimes tell my co founder that being a robotics company is not super exciting for me, but using your robotic capability to have very good visibility into your customer's business is the big opportunity for us. And so every very successful robotics companies has become very software heavy when they're able to get access to that sort of information. And we want to basically make warehouses of all sizes very competitive and build a very robust, flexible supply chain.
I see. Do you have any serious competitor?
Absolutely. I would say like the closest competitors for us are third wave automation, and Vecna is also a company that I respect. I think I really like the model they're going after.
How unique is your product and your approach compared to them?
I think it all goes down to just having the add-on and how successful we were able to make the add-on process. Um, because right now it can only work with few forklift models.
I see. You're trying to expand the compatible forklifts out there, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if we're able to do that, like we just can grow so much differently than a normal robotics company where you have to ship a new vehicle to your customers place every time, and um, the installation process could just be shipping off the add-on.
I see. So you're basically, I don't know if you're familiar with the Open Pilot. There's another open source company that they have a kit that you can plug into the
Comma AI.
yeah, it's Comma AI. So basically a forklift version of Open Pilot or Comma AI, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I have huge respect for George Hotz and what they're doing at Comma. And yeah, I think the fact that they have been able to compete with multi-billion-dollar companies out there, and I think I would consider them like number two to like number two or three to like Tesla and Waymo's autonomy. It's just a testament to it's a really hard problem, but if you're able to solve it, you can compete with such different um, level of resources.
I see. But your product is not open source, is it?
No, not. I mean, we've thought about like potentially doing the open source. I would say the difference is that it's very like electronics and hardware heavy. Um, so like the path planning part, a lot of the machine learning for picking up and putting down pallets is not like a huge portion of the work that we've done so far.
I see. I see. What trends in robotics excite you the most, and how do you see Cavalla fitting into the broader industry, like the broader robotics industry?
The trends that really excite me, one is robotics companies providing the service. And I think historically, when you were selling to other companies, a lot of times you would spend a big chunk of your time just integrating with their systems, etc. So I think service providers will build very exciting companies out there. And the other trend for me is seeing a lot of robotics generalists, because I remember even like 5 years ago, it took so many people to like assemble a very capable team. But now, when we have people who can go throughout this stack and improve it, first, you can have very lean teams. And second, even in like bigger teams, you're able to communicate so much better across the stack. And what was the second part of that question?
The second part was, how do you see Cavalla fitting into the broader industry?
I think for us, as I said, the exciting opportunity is like having the information about the operations of our customers and being like very close to what they're doing. And I think if we're able to do that, like we can also like build such a better infrastructure for other robotics companies to enter logistics. And I think, that's another trend that I'm super excited about, just seeing these new companies go after industries that haven't been digitized, for example, manufacturing, logistics, farming. And I think as soon as we have a few software first companies entering these markets and getting market share, then you're able to see a lot more robotics companies coming in because you don't have to do the upfront integration with customers. You don't have to go into a company that has no idea what robotics is.
I see that. That's a good segue to my next question, which is what advice do you have to young robotics engineers? Because a lot of them want to start something, but again, robotics, it's like the first proof of concept, like the MVP development. First of all, how do you find a good idea? And like, second, like things are expensive if you, especially if you want to incorporate machine learning and AI stuff like that. It could be expensive. You probably will need a bigger team. I'm impressed with like you and your co-founder, just two of you were able to develop a proof of concept, develop a product, raise funding, and just move on. But what advice do you have for young robotics engineers who want to pursue what you are doing now?
I can definitely give advice for anybody who wants to potentially start their company. And for me, it's don't just stop at robotics. Definitely get to know a specific customer segments that you're excited about. And I think there's always so many interesting real world things that you get to know. For example, like with the longshoremen striking, I think a lot of us got to know about how complicated the process of port automation is, and what are the real world like challenges that um, a robotics company would face if they went that route. So I think like a lot of times knowing what to build is as important as building it. And so if somebody is able to do both, I think they become infinitely more valuable.
Great advice. Thank you for that, Mohammed. We can wrap up here. And if you have any final thoughts, feel free to share it with anyone who might listen or watch. Otherwise, we can wrap it up here.
Thank you. Yeah, really appreciate this,